I think, on a sustainable position. There's been a massive impact from COVID in terms of the changed patterns of behaviour, the fact that commuter traffic is still only around 60% of what it was pre-pandemic, and I think because of what people are now able to do with technology and the changed working patterns, I suspect that isn't going to come back. We've seen an increase in leisure travel, so I think the railways need to be more flexible. We need a proper 7-day railway where we don't depend on people coming to work voluntarily, and we need a sustainable long-term position for rail. So I think that would probably be the first thing I would say. But I'm also very conscious that the vast majority of journeys that people take are either on roads or they're active travel, they're walking or cycling, or they're using buses locally. So I think it's also making sure that, as well as the inevitable conversations we have about rail, which are driven by the current position, the impact of the pandemic and what the department spends its money on, I'm very conscious we need to make sure we continue investing in roads. We have to obviously play our part in delivering our net zero ambitions in decarbonising transport across all of the modes, and ensuring we continue investing in roads, we continue investing in buses, and we make sure that we enable people to get around. I suppose the final thing is the government is very clear that we need to grow the economy, we need to improve economic growth, and I think the autumn statement and the fact that the Chancellor maintained our budgets, both capital and revenue, the government sees investment in transport as a way of driving growth in the economy. So I think all of those things is how I would measure whether we're successful.
Thank you for the clarity there. Obviously, you were appointed actually on my birthday, 25th of October, so around about 6 weeks in the job. Just some brief answers, really, so there's no need for explanation, but what are your top 3 immediate priorities in the role after your first 6 weeks?
So I think the first thing that's sort of been thrust into place, again, I won't go into it in detail because we'll come back to it, is obviously dealing with the situation on the railways, partly industrial action, and then connected to that, partly the lack of proper service delivery on some routes that people well know, on Avanti West Coast, on TPE. So those are issues which are raised with me both by colleagues and members of the public raised them as well, and you get asked about them perfectly understandably when I met with Northern Mayors as well. So that's been one. The second one, of course, I've referred to the autumn statement, and whilst it was very welcome that we had our budgets confirmed, as with every department, we're obviously having to manage the impact of inflation, and so we're working through the settlement that we got in the autumn statement and how we're going to continue delivering our priorities, and that work is underway in the department, and I'm spending a considerable amount of time on that. And that really is driving our other priorities. So, and then I suppose the third one, as a new Secretary of State, is getting my head around the breadth of the department, meeting all of the key members of staff, working with Bernadette and Gareth and their teams, and kind of getting my head around the breadth of the department. I suppose those are my 3 things that I've been focused on since I was appointed.
Super. Pleased to hear it, and I do hope you'll visit the other offices around the country of the department. I enjoyed doing so in the summer. Maybe a question for your 2 permanent secretaries, but you might want to jump in, I don't know. But ministerial portfolios in the department have been significantly reshuffled twice in the last 3 months. What effect has this on the continuity of policy direction? And is there work in which the department is behind as on schedule as a result of that?
Well, look, it's clear that it's not been ideal that there's been so much change in ministers and portfolios. I mean, I think that's kind of goes without saying a bit. But I think actually I'm very fortunate. I think we've got a very strong ministerial team. Of course, this committee will be very familiar with the Rail Minister, your former chair. And I've also got a very good ministerial team. Baroness Vere remained as the sort of institutional memory or the continuity, but I think we've got a very strong team across the board. I've altered the portfolios and settled them, I think, to match people's skills. And I think, of course, the blessing of a very strong department at official level and the way our system works is, of course, even with change in the ministerial team, there's been a lot of continuity in obviously the work that officials have been carrying forward. And so actually as when I've taken on previous ministerial roles, you come into the department, you're brought up to speed very quickly, but actually a lot of work goes on, and actually the department's been very good, I think, at identifying key decisions that needed to be taken, getting them in front of ministers, and I think we've managed to keep things going quite well. I don't know, Bernadette, whether you want to add anything.
I would strongly agree with that. I mean, inevitably, when we've had a fairly extended period of uncertainty, really since the start of the leadership election this summer, and then changes of ministers, that causes some sort of, there are some decisions that absolutely need to be put in front of ministers, and that ministers need to be confident that they fully understand before they can take them. So, there are some areas where we just need to recognise that changes in ministers will mean that we have to take that time and rightly allow new ministers with new portfolios to be comfortable with decision making. But we are a department, we are very focused on delivery through our arm's length bodies, we are very kind of operational in terms of dealing with disruption to the transport network. Those sorts of activities continue to proceed, and I think we are able to get on and do that delivery, and obviously we've always made sure that when we've had a new Secretary of State and ministerial team, we get, as you say, we prioritise the key decisions, get them in front of ministers at the earliest possible date, and keep cracking on. And I think we've been able to strike a good balance there.
Dame Kelly. I don't know if to call you Dame Kelly or Bernadette, really.
Bernadette's fine.
Gareth, Mr Davis, anything to add to that, or shall I ask my next?
Just to emphasise, I think what we do have is obviously the continuity of the civil service teams and structures behind that. So what that means is you're able to keep the institutional knowledge and expertise focused on areas, as Bernadette says, on say delivery of HS2 through to the transport decarbonisation plan, or managing some of the operational issues we faced at the start of summer. So that's been able to keep the sort of continuity as we brought new ministers up to speed and made sure they have the opportunity to shape and direct the department.
Thank you. Final question from me for now. Departmental responses to a number of consultations across a variety of policy areas are outstanding. So is there a lack of capacity to see these pieces of work through, or are they imminently about to be released before Christmas or immediately in the new year?
I'm not sure.
Well, just on the reports that are outstanding, I know on the report that the committee did on the integrated rail plan, we wrote and secured an extension to respond fully to next March, but we did commit to providing an update by the end of the year, and we plan to do so. On the report that the committee did on road pricing, that's going to be responded to by the Treasury, and they're going to reply in due course. I don't have a specific time.
Some imminent correspondence to the Treasury and the
indeed,
and the Chancellor. So, thank you for that, Ben.
And one of the responses we're still waiting for is the one on pavement parking, which closed 2 years ago. When might we see that?
Yes, I think a letter came to the committee to set out that we were considering that and looking at taking that forward. One of the things we're looking at is our legislative priorities. So that's not something that's been forgotten. I'm very well aware of it. I had it raised with me, in fact, when I was a backbencher as a constituency member of Parliament. So it hasn't been forgotten. I just don't have a specific date to come back to the committee.
Your predecessor, who wasn't there for very long, but in that period did have time to come and see us, dropped the bombshell that the government was dropping the transport bill. But she was very clear that she thought there'd be a narrow, small transport bill. Is that still the case in this session? Is that your expectation?
I think my predecessor said that there wasn't going to be a transport bill in this session. There are clearly things which the department, and obviously we'll go back and look at exactly what she said, but I think that's
she said she'd be bringing forward a narrow transport bill during this session. Yeah.
Right. Well, I checked what she said, and I thought she said we'll check and clarify it, but I think she confirmed to the committee that there wouldn't be a transport bill this session, but we'll go back and have a look and confirm. The department does obviously have some legislative priorities for the fourth session, and obviously we'll be setting out our plans for that, but obviously that depends on parliamentary time being available, and that's decisions are obviously taken across government when you look at the government's priorities.
On so many of the issues that are in your department's responsibility, from pavement parking, which causes misery for millions of our constituents, to the fact that we are years behind as a country in regulating e-scooters, all of these things that are holding us back, legislation and regulation on self-driving vehicles. We're also falling years behind our economic competitors because your department has failed to do this stuff. So when are you going to do it?
Well, I've made it very clear, Mr Bradshaw, we do have a number of things where we require legislation, but you know, as a very experienced parliamentarian who's also served in government, that decisions about the legislative programme for the full session are not entirely for me. I will set out within government what I think are priorities for the department, and then the government as a whole will conclude about its priorities. And that will be set out in due course. But that isn't entirely a matter for me, much as I wish it were. But the department's clear about the things that we wish to prioritise, and the committee will have discussed that with my predecessor and her predecessor. But it's not within my gift to set out the legislative priorities for the full session. But we're very clear. All of the things that you said are things that I want to achieve, and we'll be making that case very strongly within government.
What is it that's preventing the government as a whole legislating on these very important matters, meaning that we are being left behind as a country?
Well, I think over the last couple of years, it's fairly obviously the legislative timetable for the entire parliamentary term has been rather transformed by events. I mean, COVID clearly had a massive impact on the government's entire programme. And obviously there are other things going on in the world which have meant that the government's had to take steps.
The turmoil inside government itself and the constant chopping and changing of prime ministers and ministers, the inability to agree on a policy and then stick to it. You don't think that's got anything to do with it?
No, certain things that you've mentioned there I don't think are things that have changed at all, but there have been changes priorities. Let me just pick up one, for example. The government spent a lot of time since the beginning of the year. We've had the Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine. That's necessitated a very significant amount of government funding, over £100 billion being spent on supporting energy prices, and a significant amount of government effort looking at supporting individuals. And there have been a lot of changes across government to deal with that transformation in the economy, and a lot of time taken up by ministers and in Parliament dealing with the consequences of that effect. That's not something that could have been predicted. And events have impacted on what the government's focused its time on.
Are you prepared to commit to addressing those three issues? They're not huge issues, but they're issues that are of massive concern to our constituents that we've been waiting for years on: pavement parking, e-scooters and self-drive vehicles. Will this be done before the next election?
Well, I'm very clear that those are priorities for my department, but you're a very experienced parliamentarian. You know that I do not have the ability to promise specific legislation in the full session. I will make my case inside government. There are competing priorities for the government, and decisions will be taken collectively about our legislative priorities. But those things that you've mentioned are important priorities for me, and I will be making that case very strongly.
Do you not see that it leaves the impression that the government as a whole, not you, because you fight for transport's interests, but the government as a whole really couldn't care less about transport in this country?
No, I strongly disagree. I think it's very clear when you look at what... if you judge people by putting their money where their mouth is, as people often do, I think it's very clear from the autumn statement and the fact that the Chancellor didn't do what some governments in the distant past have done, which is to raid capital spending to get out of financial... to plug gaps. Actually, we had our capital budget confirmed, and indeed capital budgets were confirmed across government, and our revenue budget was confirmed. So actually, I think the government's investing in transport very strongly. We've confirmed our investment in some very significant transport projects to grow the economy and to get the economy functioning better. So actually, I'd say the government was investing in transport and putting transport very highly. As far as legislation is concerned, there are competing priorities. There are lots of things that are important to our constituents across a range of factors, and the government has to weigh those up. I will be making the case very strongly for transport, but as you know, those decisions are taken collectively across government, and I want to get off on the right foot with the committee. I don't want to promise the committee things that I'm not able to deliver. Things that are entirely within my control, I can promise. I can promise to go and argue for things inside government, but I can't commit at this stage for fourth-term legislative time for a transport bill.
Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much for that, Ben. Just because Ben has asked obviously some very searching questions, could we seek some clarification from you and your two colleagues, maybe with some written statement maybe that we could have that will give some clarification? I understand that it's very difficult for you in the department to say when legislation might well be coming forward, but that might just be helpful for all of us. And before, I know that Ruth's going to ask some questions.
Yes,
of
course.
Point.
Yes, absolutely. And I'll set out perhaps for the committee the legislation that we've currently got underway. There is some primary legislation which people may ask about, and other things that the department is working on. For example, we're going to have to spend a fair bit of time on retained EU legislation to meet the requirements that are set out in primary legislation. So if we set out perhaps what the department's currently working on, and we can set out some of the things that will need legislation in the future, if that will be helpful to the committee.
It will be, thank you. Ruth?
Well, thank you. Secretary of State, you say that there's pressure on the legislative timetable and there are budgets issues, but many of the issues we're waiting to see legislation for don't involve a lot of spend by the department, and the legislative timetable is hardly under pressure. We've got a longer than normal recess this Christmas, and there's an awful lot of days when we're not voting on bills. So, we do think there is more to this, but the Road Safety Investigation Branch, hardly controversial, won't cost a lot of money, very popular. Will you bring that forward? We're hearing in our self-driving vehicles inquiry that the UK industry is losing out because of the delay in legislation here. So that's good for UK business. That needs to come through quickly. You say there's a lot of work to do, and certainly there is a lot of work that you will have to do to review the huge amount of EU retained law, as you said. But will the UK regulations be updated to world-leading standards, or are we going to go with a Rees-Mogg bonfire of regulations and bonfire of red tape in our attitude to vehicle safety, which is so important to so many?
Well, there's a couple of things there. Just on your first point about parliamentary time, you're absolutely right, of course, that Parliament doesn't spend all of its time voting on legislation, but actually in the same way we're doing now, I mean, actually part of what Parliament does, of course, is to there is time made available for opposition day debates, backbench debates. I mean, it's not right that the government consumes the whole of the parliamentary timetable. There are some legislative time in Parliament is made available for non-legislative purposes, so the government doesn't have the whole timetable to itself. But I've made it clear in answer to Mr Bradshaw's question that there are some priorities for my department. And you're right, some of them don't involve a huge amount of spending, but they do require legislative time to get through Parliament, and I will be making that case very strongly. On your point about regulation, I think one of the things I'm very mindful of, and one of the arguments I think that all ministers are mindful of, if we can adopt regulation which puts Britain in a leading position and sets out a clear framework, it's clearly then Britain becomes a very attractive country for getting investment, both from British companies but also from overseas investors, and that's where I want to get the country. We've seen some examples of that already, but I want to get to a position on these issues, as Mr Bradshaw set out, where we can actually be leading on these matters and be an attractive inward investment location around the world, where we can see these exciting global steps forward taking place in Britain. That's my ambition. I think it's the government's ambition, actually, because we want to drive economic growth. So one of the arguments I will be making strongly with colleagues is to exactly legislate to get that framework and put Britain right at the front of these important challenges.
Okay, and in terms of self-driving vehicles, what discussions are you having with UK firms who are developing this technology about the impact of the delay on them?
So I specifically haven't had any conversations at this point. Perhaps if I can ask Gareth to set out what the department's been doing, that may be helpful.
Sure. Thank you, Secretary of State. So we and my team have been working closely with the industry to understand the regulatory needs, and particularly working with the Law Commission. We published a review over the summer of the needs to understand particularly things like insurance, the standardised definitions of autonomy, because there's still changes in the industry. I saw Wave recently and their chief exec to understand exactly the level of where the technology is, and I don't know if you had the opportunity to go out in some of their vehicles, but it's pretty impressive what they've been able to achieve, and I think the progress is faster than a lot of people would have expected even a few years ago. They were able to set out very clearly what's been helpful about the UK environment. This is it's an awful phrase, but the regulatory sandboxes we've created, the future of mobility zones. Some of the R&D investments that the department has been able to support developments. I'd expand it out to companies like Zero Avia as well in aerospace. But they're also very clear about the standardization and clarification are needed really to build out the industry. So I think we couldn't be clearer in the department, certainly within my team, the needs of the industry. We'd like to think we've been leading the debate, especially with the Law Commission, which I think has done incredible work over the summer. But we know obviously that now needs legislation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Secretary of State, just listening to some of your answers a short while ago, I think the car manufacturing industry would like to see the country leading when it comes to legislation, certainly for the period 2030-35, because I think their view is that we're actually lagging behind at this point, the EU and the rest of the world, rather than leading from the front. But that maybe comes in the clarification about what legislation might be coming forward, if that's okay. And also, I'm particularly going to draw your attention to the fact that your predecessor and what she said when she was in front of this committee and what you've referred to. I think that we are right, and unfortunately I think your department is wrong, but we'll leave that for another day. Is that okay? So moving on to Great British Railways. Chris.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning, everybody. Nice to see you again, Bernadette, and Gareth particularly. Secretary of State, is it still your plan to fully implement the plan for rail, i.e. Great British Railways?
So it's very much my plan to achieve what the intention behind that idea, which is to get the railways to have a guiding mind behind them, to have a more integrated position between how the different parts of the industry work. What I wanted to do was take some time. As you know, there are different views about how exactly we achieve that. Not just outside Parliament, but also inside Parliament. So I wanted to take some time, not too much time, but I wanted to take some time to listen to those alternative views from some of those that have held the rail brief in the past and others. So I've started that work. I've spoken to Mr Williams. I've spoken to a number of colleagues who've got views on this matter, and I will, and talking to my colleague, the Rail Minister, and we'll reach some conclusions. So I haven't done yet, but I wanted to take some time to make sure we make the right decisions.
What we're saying then is that the Great British Railways proposal as it stands currently is up in the air.
Well, I'm taking some time to just reflect on it and to make sure when we move forward that I'm entirely happy with what we're doing. And I know there are a range of views in Parliament, and I think it's important that I take some time to listen and bear those in mind before I make any final decisions.
Given what we've just heard from you a little bit earlier about the ability to progress primary legislation, it feels as though that certainly in this session it's going to be impossible to fully implement GBR as has been set out, even though at our last session it was made clear to us that the legislation required to fully implement GBR would be relatively short and not complicated. Given that I think we are clear that legislative ability for primary legislation is not going to be possible in this session, what are actually the options available, and what realistically are you considering on changing?
Well, I've obviously said in answer to Mr Bradshaw's question that we'll look at legislation for the fall session, but there are of course things that we can do without legislation which we are continuing to work on. So we've made some commitments about rolling out contactless pay-as-you-go ticketing to more stations in the southeast. That work is underway. We've already got the GBR transition team working, so we've already got some of the...
Could I just come back to you
on that? Of course.
My understanding is that contactless travel and ticketing was contracted some time ago, and that's totally separate to this. There are, I understand, many hundreds of people working on GBR as it stands today at the taxpayer's expense. We're in this situation where clearly decisions need to be made very quickly, and I wonder whether you could just share with us when you're likely to make that very clear decision as to what extent GBR will be implemented?
Well, we've already brought the transition team together, so it's already the case that we've got Network Rail and DFT teams working more closely together to look at how you align the business planning between track and train, which is one of the things that we need to do. So there's already a lot of bringing people together, working together, underway already, and I'll ask the Permanent Secretary to say a little bit more about that in a minute. There are things that you do need legislation for, and we'll be making that case. As I said, same answer, I'm afraid, as the one I gave Mr Bradshaw, which is I can't commit to doing that. But clearly there is work that can be done ahead of legislation, and of course a lot of planning can take place. And I'm on your final point, before I ask the Permanent Secretary to comment, in terms of making a decision, I aim to do that at pace. But I do also just want to say, and given what I said in my opening remarks about the amount of resource that the department spends on rail and the importance of rail, I want to make sure that we make the right decisions. And I think, given I've only been in this role a few weeks, I just want to take the time to get it right before we move ahead with it. Bernadette, did you just want to say a bit about the work that's underway?
Absolutely. So we had this discussion, of course, Mr Loader, at the last hearing as well. And I think I did confirm then that legislation would be relatively short as and when it's brought forward. And as we discussed then, there are some things which you require legislation in order to change fundamentally, including who is the formal franchising authority. However, as the Secretary of State has indicated, a great deal of the sort of purpose and sort of intent of rail reform set out in the White Paper can be taken forward without legislation. Steps to improve and roll out, extend flexible ticketing, steps to drive workforce reform, other measures to just ensure that the railway is operating more effectively and efficiently in the interests of taxpayers and passengers. There are many things that don't require legislation, and colleagues in my department, in Network Rail, etc., and in the industry are working together to drive those improvements as far and as effectively as we can, with or without legislation. So that work does indeed continue.
Thank you. My understanding is the only thing that's really required in legislative terms is the franchising authority change.
Yeah, which I referred to.
That's correct. So given that this process started, if I recall correctly, back in 2017, under the then Secretary of State, the member for Epsom and Ewell, we are some 5 years down the line. Given we have many hundreds of people working on this at considerable expense, do you have a timeline to which you are working for certain milestones to be delivered, even if it's not the full suite of the original proposal?
Yes, there are still plans within the department for taking forward the various work streams that I've described that don't require legislation. And obviously we will work with the Secretary of State and under his direction to ensure those are taken forward in a way that he is satisfied is right.
Yeah, thank you. The Rail Network Enhancements Plan, the RNEP, could you tell us when we're going to see that, please?
Yeah, so as I said in my answer earlier, one of the things that we're now doing in the department, and we're doing this at some considerable effort and pace, is to work through both our capital and our revenue plans following the autumn statement. So one of the things I'm doing with my ministerial team is looking at how we manage as I said, we had our capital and our revenue budgets confirmed, but obviously we are having to deal with, as all government departments are, and indeed the private sector, the inflation pressures. So we're looking at our capital investments and looking at the priorities on those, and we will set out, I know that some of these things haven't been published for some time, we will set all of those out when we've reached conclusions on our capital and our revenue priorities. Are you coming under
particular pressure from the Treasury to find savings?
No, well, as I said, our budgets were confirmed in cash terms, but of course there are significant inflation priorities that we have to manage, and we're working through those priorities now with my ministerial team across all of the areas of capital expenditure and all the areas of revenue. As I said, the information in terms of our total expenditure was set out at the autumn statement, and those numbers are as they were set out in the spending review, but there are some priorities that we need to adjust.
At this moment in time, you're not able to indicate when we'll see the RNEP coming forward or confirmed?
No, it's our intention to publish it when we've reached conclusions,
Okay.
but we're obviously working that through following the autumn statement.
Thank you. I'd just like to move on to the next section, if I may, Chairman.
I'll let you.
Thank you. Disruption on the railways. Secretary of State, your predecessor sent us a letter on the 20th of October. When I say sent us, I don't mean the committee, I mean members of Parliament, outlining the Transport Strikes Minimum Service Levels Bill and the intentions. Could you tell us when we can expect the second reading of that to come forward to the House of Commons?
Yes, so as you know, and from the way that letter was set out, the bill has been introduced in Parliament. It hasn't yet had a second reading. I can't give the committee a specific time on that. I would just say, as I've said publicly on that, that may well be, that legislation, a lead to an improvement in the medium to long term. But of course, that legislation, however fast it's progressed, given that it's got to go through both the House of Commons and the House of Lords, is not a solution to dealing with the industrial action we see at the moment. The other thing I would say is, whilst that legislation may well improve the service that passengers receive on strike days, I think my priority is to try and ensure that we can resolve the industrial dispute so that passengers don't have strike days, rather than achieving, that's how you get better service to passengers, is to resolve the disputes rather than have slightly better service on strike days.
I should have declared, Chairman, I apologise, as a former member of the RMT and a former employee of the railways. I'm sorry I didn't do that.
Should be accepted, and you're admonished.
So are we then saying that that legislation actually has little value at all?
No, I'm saying that
if it's not going to affect the situation today, and particularly the coming weeks, because we're seeing considerable strike action, is that bill actually valuable?
So I'm saying that bill, two things, I think, but both of those things are true. The bill absolutely may well contribute value in the future, but it's clearly, given that it would have to go through Parliament, if you look at the way the bill's drafted, there then has to be some agreement and some secondary legislation, and quite a bit of work has to take place even when the bill's on the statute book. It's clearly not going to be something that's going to help with the industrial action that we face today. And one of the reasons, as I set out in my opening statement, why I felt it important to meet with the trade union leaders and to try and help facilitate, working with the Rail Minister, better talks between both sides, the employers and the unions, is to try and get us to a resolution of the present industrial dispute, conscious that it's going to lead to terrible inconvenience for passengers.
There are many, many millions of people who are adversely affected by these strikes. We have here in Parliament, when necessary, pushed through legislation quite quickly, and it can be done. Is it no longer the government's intention to push this through rapidly, and are they reconsidering it?
So, you're right. Usually legislation that is pushed through rapidly tends to have to be pushed through when there's cross-party agreement on that legislation, and and that I don't think is the case here. But look, it is my firm intention to try and get to a position where we can resolve the industrial dispute. You're absolutely right. It's going to cause enormous inconvenience for passengers, particularly over Christmas. It's also going to create tremendous inconvenience for many businesses. And I'm very conscious, for example, with the hospitality industry, who've last couple of Christmas periods have suffered tremendously because of COVID. This was going to be the first Christmas period, which is very busy for the industry, that they were going to be able to trade normally. And I'm very disappointed that they're going to be damaged, which is why I call on the unions even at this stage to call off those strikes at Christmas. But all I'm saying is the legislation it isn't going to be a solution to the industrial dispute today.
I'm going to get a kicking for time. But I just wanted to finally ask you then, given you met with the unions only last week, and the RMT particularly has continued to call for more strikes, is there real value in the meetings that you have with union leaders if they're just going to continue to call for strike action?
Well, look, I always think it's better to keep talking than not talking. It's always good to have those channels of communication. I found the meetings that they were constructive meetings. I think the government did what we said we were going to do. We said we would help facilitate communication between unions and employers, and actually following my meeting, the employers made a revised offer, which I think most people looking at it, given that it involves a reasonable fair pay settlement, protection against compulsory redundancies for a period, but it does insist on necessary workforce reform. I think most people would think that was fair. One trade union is putting that deal, the Network Rail deal, to its members with a recommendation to accept. That's what I would hope the RMT would do, even at this stage, looking at the inconvenience that they're going to cause to passengers and businesses. But I think keeping those channels of communication open is a good thing, rather than the opposite.
And just before I hand over to Jack to ask you about some of the issues in the north, it's our understanding that the department offered a derogation which was taken to South Eastern Railway and South Western Railway about its timetable changes. Could you tell us maybe why that is, and whether or not they will continue, their derogations going forward will continue?
So I think the derogation you're talking about is about whether there was consultation about that. I may just ask the Permanent Secretary to comment on that, since that was a decision taken before I was in the department.
It was, I think, the case that previous ministers concluded that some timetable changes should not be formally consulted upon. So I think your question is accurate.
The question is, will that continue? Are you going to continue to change the timetables without consultation?
I think that will be a matter for ministers, current ministers.
So, no, that was. I mean, you specifically referred to the past decision. I think going forward, we'll look at those circumstances. I'll make decisions on that based on all of the circumstances, and it'll depend on case by case basis, I think.
Thank you, Chris. Before we come to Jack, I'm going to come to Graham. But before we come to Graham, just got two quick fire questions for you.
Of course.
Your predecessor told us you plan to review and consult on ticket offices imminently. Is that still the department's plan?
It is still the case that we are looking at the way ticket offices operate. One of the things we're talking to the trade unions, part of the discussions, is about reforming the way they work. Very few people now, there's only about 12%, I think, of ticket purchases are done in ticket offices. One of the frustrations is you've got staff who are then in those ticket offices not actually able to be used front of house to serve passengers. So one of the things that the employers are talking to unions about is having those staff retrained, able to come out of the ticket offices and provide services to customers.
But 12% is still 1/8 of the population. That might be elderly population who like dealing in cash.
Yes, it is. No, and we absolutely want to make sure that those people that want to deal in cash and need to engage physically with purchasing tickets are still able to. But clearly, you don't want to put as much resource into ticket offices and tying staff to purely working in a ticket office when you've seen the number of tickets being purchased going down from, I think, a third to only just over 10%. So I think you need to have workforce reform, and it's about delivering a better experience to passengers to make sure those staff are able to work flexibly, selling tickets when that is required, but also able to assist customers in stations, particularly vulnerable and disabled customers who need other sorts of assistance.
Understood. And I know you've referred to the fact that we'd all like to see the intended industrial action over the Christmas period not take place, but what consideration have you given for clarification to deferring planned Christmas engineering works, if any?
So one of the things that Network Rail is now looking at, given the strikes that were called by the RMT on Network Rail, is looking at that £120 million worth of essential maintenance work to see the extent to which that's affected. And of course, even though that may not impact passenger services, it absolutely will affect the reliability of the railway. And of course, it's done at Christmas, because although I recognise it sometimes causes inconvenience to people at Christmas, it is done then because that is the least busy time to do it. If that work isn't done at the Christmas period, it means it will have to be done at other times of the year, which will cause more inconvenience to passengers. So Network Rail is working through what changes it may have to take place with its engineering work in response to the strike action that's been called by the RMT.
We have a number of questions and lots more to get through, so I'm going to move on to Graham Morris.
Thanks, Chair, and good morning to the Secretary of State, the panel. I've got a couple of questions on the rail dispute and a couple of observations as well, but just in relation to your comments there about the the proposed minimum standards rail bill, which will be hugely controversial. I don't think anyone's in any doubt that will completely sour industrial relations at a time when we're trying to build a settlement. But why is it, Secretary of State, that there's time for this controversial piece of legislation that's been driven by your department, and yet apparently there isn't time to deal with quite a number of issues identified by my colleagues regarding pavement parking, regarding the regulation of e-scooters, of autonomous vehicles and so on, where there is a cross-party agreement that we need to crack on with these. It seems slightly perverse that we can find time for one hugely controversial piece of legislation and not for another.
Well, I'd say a couple of things. First of all, Mr. Morris, I think you've confirmed what I was implying in my answer to Mr. Loader, which is that taking that legislation forward rapidly, the minimum service levels legislation would not be possible, since there wouldn't be a cross-party agreement, and you need that if you're going to...
Shorter answers without repetition would be really helpful, because we've got a lot to get through.
Does that answer this question?
Yes, of course. Look, it's a balance, Mr. Bradshaw. I'm trying to give full answers, but I accept if you wish me to move a little more
you don't need to repeat things you've already said.
Very happy to do so. So I welcome that. On your issue about balancing these things off, that legislation, of course, was already introduced in this session. The wider transport bill, my predecessor, I think, confirmed it wouldn't be taking place this session, and I've made it clear in answer to my earlier question that it's got a range of things in it which are priorities for me, but I need to make that case with colleagues in government.
I understand. You did explain that earlier. I appreciate that. Can I ask now, particularly about the rail dispute? Now, I do support your philosophy of continuing to talk, and I'm heartened by the fact that the rail freight operating companies, the Scottish Government, the Welsh Government, and I think the open access train operating companies have all reached settlements with the rail unions. So it must be possible. It's not an impossible task to achieve a settlement. But they haven't placed preconditions in relation to ticket office closures or the acceptance of driver-only operated trains. Is there any prospect of continuing the talks to secure such a settlement if these preconditions are attached?
Well, I don't want to get too far into specific details, because I do think it's important that negotiations take place between the employers and the unions, and I think both sides accept that. On the overall stance, though, I do think it's important that this isn't just a dispute about pay. It is a dispute also about modernising the railway and having workforce reform. And as I said, in my opening statement, I think I captured, I do think in order for the railways to have a sustainable future, we do have to see reform in the way they operate. It isn't going to be sustainable for the taxpayer to continue to put in the sums it has put in without seeing that reform. It's the reform generates the savings that help fund the pay rise, and I think both of those things are part of the debate. But I think keeping talking is very valuable.
But Secretary said, I'm sure the trade unions appreciate that. And over a long period of time, the first job I ever had, I was a member of the NUI, even before my colleague Chris Loader was a twinkle. I was a member of the railway union. Before it was the RMT, but you know, and over a long period of time they've accepted changes, modernisation, reforms, and so on. But one of the things that we've identified as a committee in relation to another inquiry we're doing about access for disabled people are the concerns about if there are a closure of ticket offices, if there are stations without staff, if there are driver-only operated trains, how does that square with our commitment under the Equality and Human Rights Commission requirements to ensure that disabled and elderly and vulnerable people can access the railways? And is that not a factor in your negotiations? Is a more gradual approach not more likely to be beneficial? Because we'll have to address these legal considerations, won't we?
Brevity. finish? Sorry.
Yes, look, look, on the general point, I do want to make sure the railways are very accessible. You may well know in my ministerial history, I was the Minister for Disabled People. I take this very seriously. It's one of the reasons in setting out portfolios for my ministerial team, I've made sure everyone has a responsibility to deliver accessible transport. So part of the reason, what all the government said is that we need to see that reform. It is important that the detail of that reform, how you deliver it, the timescale over which you deliver it, and the flexibility of the staff and making sure there's proper service for customers is very important. That's why the detail needs to be hammered out between the employers, both on the points you're talking about, the train operating companies and the unions. The detail needs to be hammered out, but I think the principle of reform is very valuable. You know, in answer to my question on ticket office, I made the point, you don't want people tied to sitting behind a desk not serving very many customers. I want them to be able to also to serve customers in the station. The detail of how that works is for the unions and the employers to hammer out between them, which is why I want to see them continuing to talk to reach an agreement that they feel that the unions can then recommend to their members.
I just want to very quickly refer to, I'm not a Telegraph reader, I must confess, but there is an article in the Telegraph today which suggests that the Treasury or Number 10 are insisting on a precondition before the negotiations can move forward of the unions accepting driver-only operation. I don't know what the time frame is or if that's just in principle, but are you in a position to confirm or deny that report's correct?
Well, I haven't seen the report, so I can't really comment on it. I haven't seen it. On the specific point about driver-only operation, we've obviously seen that on quite a significant part of the railway already, so I don't think there's an in-principle objection to it. I know that it is controversial, but you know, it's something that exists on the railways already. In terms of what I want to see, I mean, I want the two sides to continue talking. The government has facilitated. I was asked to facilitate an improved offer. It was made clear to me when I met Mr Lynch that, you know, on the train operating side there hadn't been an offer. There now has been an offer. I would urge the two sides to continue talking, the unions to call off the strikes. I think that's the right thing for passengers, and I think it's also the right thing for the
We've heard that message countless times. There's a front page splash in the Daily Telegraph on Monday alleged that Number 10 had intervened and put driver-only trains on the table. Excuse me, Chair, this is really important. The Secretary of State is getting away without answering the question. You said I was coming after Graham. You said I was coming after Graham.
Jack's been waiting very patiently to ask questions.
I will come back in. I will come back in.
And Secretary of State, if you'll answer it, then we'll move to Jack.
You can't claim you didn't see the splash on Monday in the Daily Telegraph claiming Number 10 at the last minute has added driver-only trains as an issue to this dispute. Was that report incorrect?
Well, I was specifically talking, Mr Morris asked me a question about a report today, which I haven't seen.
It was on Monday.
On the general point,
Secretary of State, did you not see this report, and is it true?
No, I've been very clear that we've... I was asked to facilitate
the issue
new
of
offer.
Driver-only trains being introduced by the Number 10 or the Treasury at the last minute. It wasn't on the table before.
On reform, we're very clear.
No, answer the question.
We're very clear we need to see reform.
The question.
On the specifics about detailed negotiations are taking place between employers and trade unions. It's not the government's role to micromanage the detail of the reform. But we've been clear that we do need to see workforce
operators
reform.
And the unions both say that this issue has been inserted in the last week by Number 10 or the Treasury, which has scuppered a deal that was on the table.
Well,
that is what both the train operators and the unions
just
have told
on that
us.
point about scuppering a deal, when that was already on the table, when I met Mr Lynch, he made it very clear to me that he hadn't had an offer on the train operating side of the house. There had been an offer on Network Rail. I met with the trade unions. I was asked to facilitate an improvement. We then saw...
Wasn't my question. You're not answering the question.
No, I am telling you what's been going on. There was then an improved offer to the unions from Network Rail, and an offer then came on the train operating side of the house. that the unions could consider. I regret that they rejected that offer. I think it would have been better if they'd continued talking to try and hammer out some detail.
If you won't answer
you
won't answer the question, why do you think Scotland and Wales have settled?
There haven't been...
Why do you think they've settled?
There haven't been preconditions. Yes, there needs to be reform. I've been very clear. You have to have reform to drive the savings. And I'm telling you what's going on. I'm not going to provide a running commentary.
You're avoiding the question.
You want to know who's pulling the strings.
Yeah, we're avoiding the question. I mean, the public want to know what's going on here. They have a right to know if Number 10 intervened to stop a deal by adding driver-only trains at the last minute, which is what the companies, not the unions, the companies say happened.
No one is trying to stop a deal. Quite the reverse. I met with the trade unions. I felt that conversation was important. And actually, we then saw an improved deal coming on both sides, both the train operating companies and Network Rail. We're trying to reach a deal here. It's the trade unions that have rejected, or the RMT that's rejected. And I think that's regrettable. And I've said it's very disappointing from the point of view of passengers. I'm very clear. I want to see a deal reached. I think we could have
avoided the Christmas chaos. Number 10 have now guaranteed Christmas chaos.
We've made a fair and reasonable...
It's not even answering the question. It's not even
Ben, everybody can watch, and the record will show you've asked your questions. The Secretary of State has answered them.
The public will have seen you haven't answered the question.
Thank you, Ben.
Question, you might not like the answer, but there is a fair and reasonable offer on the table, and I think it's regrettable that the RMT is going ahead with strikes rather than putting that offer to its members.
Thank you, Ben. Secretary of State, we're moving on a little bit behind time, but Jack, thank you very much for your patience. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. And firstly, why is it that rail services are particularly so bad in the north and parts of the Midlands?
Well, the reason for the recent downturn in performance is largely, not entirely, but largely to do with the fact that there's been two issues, I think. Partly there's been a driver shortage, which occurred as a result of the pandemic and the fact that there was a lack of driver training. So that's been one of the causes. The department's worked closely with the train operating companies to get those drivers trained, and we've seen a significant increase in driver availability, which has improved matters. The other issue is that, and this comes back to the need for workforce reform, too much of the timetable is dependent on what's called rest day working, which is where drivers have to volunteer to work on days in order to deliver a timetable. That means that the railway is not very sustainable, because if those drivers stop working on those rest days, you end up with trains being cancelled at the last minute and a very flaky and unreliable service. And that is what we have seen on both TransPennine Express and on Avanti West Coast. And that's not acceptable. So one of the things that Avanti we're expecting them to do with their new December timetable, which kicks in on the 11th of December, there'll be a very significant increase in the service that they're offering. The only tragedy for passengers, and I heard this loud and clear when I met with Northern Mayors last week, the tragedy is because of the industrial action, that improved timetable, which would both have more services, more reliably delivered, passengers are not going to see the benefit of that, because almost as soon as that new timetable kicks in, there's going to be a set of national industrial action. So again, another reason why I hope it stops. So part of the reason why we need workforce reform is to get rid of this reliance on rest day working, to have a proper 7-day railway, so that we have a reliable service for all of those people that need a reliable train service, whether it's to get to work, to see members of their family, or to do all the important things that they have to do. And I think that would help secure the long-term future of the railway.
As you've suggested, Avanti are proposing to increase their number of trains every day from 180 to 264. Do you have any confidence that they'll be able to actually run those trains?
Well, let me just put aside, and I'll try to keep Mr. Bradshaw happy, not repeat myself, putting aside industrial action, if the industrial action wasn't taking place, then I do think they would be able to deliver that. There has been a significant number of new drivers. I think they're able to deliver that timetable.
Previously, I was promised in October that we would see, with the September changes to timetable, that we would see near enough return of full services, and that failed to materialise. So we have been here and seen this before, haven't we? So why should we now assume that from December to the December timetable changes that we are actually going to see all of these trains being restored?
Well, let me answer that first, and then I may just ask Bernadette to comment on the previous implementation. So we've been working very closely with the department, with the company, to test, the drivers that they have available, the robustness of whether they think they can, of whether we think they can deliver that timetable. We think they can. As I said, the difficulty is, and I'm very clear, I want to hold Avanti to account to deliver the services that they've promised for passengers. One of the difficulties is I can hold them to account for things they can control. The thing that's going to stop me being able to do that is the industrial action, because they're going to perfectly reasonably be able to turn around if they don't deliver that timetable and point to the industrial action. So I want a period where we don't have industrial action, where we can hold them to account. They've made some clear commitments. We think they can deliver those commitments, and I want to see them deliver those for passengers. But they're clearly not going to deliver those commitments if 2 days after they roll out the new timetable, we see 4 days of industrial action. And Bernadette, do you want to just comment on Mr. Brereton's perfectly reasonable point on the September timetable?
Indeed, and I think, in fairness, I think we are stress testing these plans, recognising that sort of over-promising and under-delivering only sort of exacerbates the frustration that passengers and people feel about services. I think a lot more work has been done now to deal with the backlog of driver training and to reduce the reliance on rest day working, which is why we believe this should be a more deliverable now proposition. And I think lessons have been learned by the company, and certainly my department working with the company to ensure that is the case. As the Secretary of State rightly says, industrial action will prevent those service levels from being delivered. There is also an ongoing, I think, issue which I know the company is working hard with ASLEF on, to ensure that ASLEF is cooperating on rosters as well. So it is also dependent upon that. So, but as I say, certainly my department has been working closely with Avanti to make sure that this new timetable is one which they can effectively deliver.
Avanti's services have seen, in terms of the number of trains on time, has been less than half. So, the previous Secretary of State didn't take the contract off Avanti. Do you think that decision was a mistake?
So, look, I've had quite strong opinions expressed to me both by colleagues in Parliament and also when I met the Northern Mayors last week about what they think should happen to the contract, and I asked them, for example, to write to me to set out their views with the evidence. I'm focused on delivering better services for passengers. I mean, decisions will be taken in due course about what happens to the contract. I think at the moment, the best thing we can do is to try and get them to deliver against their promises. As I said, we have been stress testing and kicking the tyres on their promises. The reduced reliance on rest day working, the increased number of drivers. So we think they can deliver these promises. I mean, the proof of the pudding will be in the eating, but it is going to be disrupted by the industrial action. So, but I'm very focused. I've heard from colleagues who use that service. I've heard from members of the public. I've heard from others who are engaged with it. And of course, it's worth saying that the regime that these companies get paid under, there's a small amount which is a fixed fee, but a bigger amount is based on their performance, and that's independently assessed, and that determines how much money they earn from the contract. So the company is very well aware that if it doesn't deliver, that will impact the amount of money that it receives from the taxpayer.
And are you looking at potential financial penalties on Avanti and on TransPennine?
Well, the way the contract is set up, there's a 0.5% is a fixed fee, but 1.5% of the fee is based on their performance, and that's independently assessed. So if they don't deliver the things they say they're going to deliver, then that will materially impact the fee they get from the department for running those services. So they're very well aware of that, and I'm very well aware of the service at the moment is simply not acceptable. for customers who aren't able to rely on it at the moment. And I'm very clear, if we're going to have a long-term future for the railway, we need a reliable service that passengers can count on in every part of the country.
Many passengers have been impacted by very short-term changes as well, less than 48 hours in some cases of timetable changes, tickets not being available for sale at all in some cases. So have you looked at the wider implications of this, the social, the economic implications of this decision because of how short-term and how significant the impacts have been on passengers?
Yes, I have. I'm very conscious, and I've listened to many of the stories about how people have been impacted, that, not having a reliable service, having trains cancelled at short notice when people then can't change their journeys very easily, it has a massive impact on people's ability to go to work, people's ability to attend important appointments, to attend education, and impacts a lot on businesses as well, and people being able to travel to large events, for example. That was a point made very strongly to me when I met the Northern Mayors last week. They made a very strong point about the impact on their regional economy, which is why I think it's so very important that we get those services being delivered as they should be and as promised.
In terms of Network Rail as well, and Ben and I hosted the OOR yesterday for a briefing with parliamentarians, and the OOR have raised quite a lot of concerns about Network Rail's performance as well. Every region of Network Rail has been performing worse than they did previously in terms of the delays that they are causing to the rail industry. So what are you doing to ensure that Network Rail are performing and addressing these issues that we're seeing?
So, one of the issues, of course, is to try and get Network Rail and the train operating companies to work more closely together. So part of, going back to my answer to Mr. Loader, part of what we're doing is trying to get those two parts of the industry to work more closely together. And I'm very conscious that we need to reduce the impact, and it's part of the reason why it's going to be disappointing that we don't get as much of the maintenance work done over the Christmas period, because you need to do it when the railway is less busy so that you have a more reliable railway. One of the things I took into account when we signed off the high level output specification and the periodic review budget that we just signed off was to make sure we continue investing in today's railway to keep up the quality and the performance of the network, as well as investing in new railways. So that's one of the things that I will keep a continuing focus on. I don't know whether the Permanent Secretary wants to add anything to my
Colleagues, I'm just
answer.
going to interrupt as you're asking your colleague, Secretary of State. I'm conscious it has gone 10:30. We are still on rail. We have a lot to get through. So brevity in answers, but colleagues, particularly brevity in questions, please, as we move forward.
Of course.
That's okay. Back to you, Jack.
I don't think I have a great deal to add to what the Secretary of State said. I certainly would emphasise I'm not sure what the particular issues around performance ORR were raising with you and colleagues yesterday were.
They've stated very clearly that in their latest figures that every single one of the 5 regions of Network Rail are performing worse than they were, and this is having an impact on the delays of services.
And so this is the maintenance, the normal maintenance and renewal type of activity. So first thing I would say is there has been an absolute transformation already in the way that Network Rail works with operators over recent years, and that is continuing. I can certainly remember when I was first involved in rail, Network Rail and operators were sort of often warring factions, and I think there is now enormous cooperation and joint planning of things like works to minimise disruption, and generally speaking I think NR performs very, very much better than it has historically in those areas. Obviously where there's a deterioration in performance, then we expect ORR to hold them to account, and we in the department will hold them to account too. Clearly NR themselves have also been impacted by industrial action, which will not have improved performance in recent months.
What are you doing to try and get Network Rail to work more collaboratively with local partners, with other organisations? Because we've seen, as Secretary of State knows, some serious problems with trying to deliver our Transforming Cities Fund investment in Stoke-on-Trent. What are you doing to make sure that Network Rail are obliged to work with local authorities, with other local key stakeholders to actually deliver the public transport improvements that we need to see?
I think the regional structure that Network Rail now has was precisely introduced in order to ensure that there is that much more effective working. That NR, I mean, it is true again historically, NR was something of a sort of national monolith, and I know that local stakeholders used to find it very frustrating engaging with NR.
I think they still are.
And it may not be perfect, and I'm sure there's always room for improvement, but the regional structure now is absolutely designed to ensure that the sort of focus of the leadership team within NR is absolutely on building that closer engagement with local stakeholders and partners and operators, and also thinking about those wider questions, as you rightly say, about integration with other forms of transport. So I think some very significant steps and improvements have been made in recent years, but I don't think NR, and if Andrew Haynes was here, I don't think he'd claim that there is no room for further improvement.
I want to move on now to discuss a bit about rail infrastructure, and particularly around Northern Powerhouse Rail and the proposals for Northern Powerhouse Rail. And the option 1 was selected by the government, and but Transport for North least preferred option. So why is it that option 1 has been selected by the government?
Well, the commitment that we've made to Northern Powerhouse Rail, the core network, remains as it was set out in the integrated rail plan, and the Chancellor confirmed one of the first questions I got asked, this was one of the first sets of questions I got asked when I was appointed to this role. The Chancellor's confirmed that we're committed to delivering the core Northern Powerhouse Rail network. Clearly, I have already, found in this job there are lots of people with views about how we do that, exactly how we lay it out. One of the conversations I had last week with Northern Mayors was there a range of views about how we take on the further stages, and we continue to listen to them. But the core Northern Powerhouse Rail network, as set out in the integrated rail plan, remains the government's commitment that we're committed to delivering.
Are you still undertaking work to reappraise options for Northern Powerhouse Rail?
So we're looking at, we've set out what we're planning on doing. There are things we are going to continue to look at. So the Prime Minister made some commitments about how we deliver high-speed services to Bradford, and we shall continue looking at how we do that. So there are still things that we're looking at, but the core network is the commitment that we've set out in the integrated rail plan, and that remains the government's position. So you haven't got a
firm option yet, then?
Well,
shall I just say, because I think your question was about why the proposals that are currently in the integrated rail plan were those were chosen, which I think predates
what we're trying to understand is whether you are still, focused on this option 1 that you put forward as the proposals through the integrated rail plan. Is that now the option, or is there still work underway to reappraise and look at alternatives?
This is still the same core plan, as the Secretary of State has said. Connectivity to Bradford is something which I know he wants to look at, and the Prime Minister has indicated he wishes to do. But there is not now a sort of reopening of the core elements of the integrated rail plan. Obviously, in putting that plan together, previous government was balancing, on the one hand, the need for the desire to make a very, very significant and transformational investment in rail in the north, with the broader demands of sort of affordability. That is what the plan does. If all of the, you may recall, it's a £96.4 billion plan. I think the National Infrastructure Commission calculated that if the government had done everything that all stakeholders had asked for, including Transport for the North, it would have been a £185 billion plan, and obviously that was judged to be unaffordable. So it's a balance between, say, commitment to transformational investment and also needing to take a realistic view of what is affordable in the long term.
With the development of HS2, there's going to be increasing focus now. Obviously, the eastern leg there's change plans there. There's going to be an increasing reliance upon services running onto the existing network, onto the classic network. So what are you doing to ensure that the investment that's needed, because there is investment that's needed on the classic network to facilitate those HS2 trains, for example, at Leeds, also my own area in Stoke-on-Trent, we need some investment in the classic network. What are you doing to make sure that Network Rail are actually putting forward that investment to facilitate HS2 services?
Well, two things. I think it's worth saying that, Mr. Loader talked about the RNet plan. It's worth just saying, I think, that the investment in the non-HS2 rail network, the capital spending, the bulk of that is going to be taking place outside London and the South East. So actually there's been a rebalancing of where we spend our rail capital investment that's not HS2 to spread that more fairly across the whole country. So there'll be a very significant investment in the north of England. And one of the things that we're very clear about is making sure that we look at HS2 and Network Rail's plans together to make sure that they interact properly. As I said, but the core network is what we've set out in the Integrated Rail Plan, and that remains the government's position. And yes, I know there are many people that would have liked us to have settled on different plans, but it's about balancing the investment. I mean, I think it's worth saying, which, you know, a lot of focus goes on the things that we're not doing and the things that people didn't get, but it is worth just saying that, you know, as I said at the beginning, we are maintaining our £20 billion investment in capital on transport, which is a very significant piece of investment, and the government's maintaining its investment in infrastructure. So I would continue to argue that, you know, it's a very significant driver of economic growth and a very significant commitment to all parts of the UK from this government on transport investment.
The final question I just wanted to ask relates to that, and it's about the methodology that's used to assess projects. And there are a lot of concerns about this that have been raised previously about, you know, how it's able to fully capture the benefits, particularly for those areas where levelling up is more important, and capture those the ability of that growth potential. Are you concerned, and do you think that the department have still got this right in terms of the methodology that is being used, and that this will, you know, deliver on the levelling up aspirations of the government?
So you're right to highlight the levelling up aspirations of the government. One of the reasons why we're committed to the core Northern Powerhouse rail network, it's exactly to join up the cities of the north to get those agglomeration benefits. I think the department's got, from my experience of it so far, the department, I think, has got a very good team of analysts who try and pull all of this information together to try and weigh up and balance all of these projects. You can do a lot of that. I mean, to some extent, you always have to put some judgment in it, and the government's going to have some strategic priorities. So I think it has to take all the analytical work, all of the attempt to boil these things down to numbers, but there is some judgment involved about what our strategic priorities are. So I think you have to weigh those things up, and that's why decisions are taken by ministers, because you've got a lot of data, but ultimately there's some strategic judgment to take as well.
Can I just add a word on this? I know the department's kind of analytical modelling and our transport appraisal methodology is often challenged. Just to say, firstly, we are constantly seeking to improve and evaluate. I think it is actually a very good analytical set of tools. It is very important. It's something we value and put a lot of effort into in the department. We are constantly seeking to improve it. Already within our modelling, we are very conscious and we explicitly identify the fact there are always going to be wider impacts which cannot be quantified. And that is very much part of our decision-making process, to acknowledge and recognise those wider impacts. As the Secretary of State has indicated, what the government is also now doing is putting more weight on the strategic case alongside a sort of standard business case in making the decisions that it does about these investments. And I do think, particularly for these very large, long-term and transformational investments, that's a very important sort of evolution of how we think about these things.
Thank you, Jack. Before I go on to Greg Smith, who's asking the next round of questions, I'm just going to warn the witnesses, if you do answer in a very elongated fashion, I will cut you off and ask your questioner to ask the next question. Is that okay? We have a lot to get through. Greg.
Thank you, Chairman. Secretary of State, the autumn statement made a big commitment on East-West Rail. What is your understanding of what that actually means? Is that the whole project as it was originally conceived, including the Aylesbury Spur, or just Oxford through to Cambridge?
So the overall commitment that Chancellor made, I think, was to set a very clear impression, given that he'd confirmed the overall spending, that the government was still committed to that project. And I think he set out subsequently, that's the whole line from Oxford to Cambridge. On your specific question, I'm either going to ask the Permanent Secretary to comment on that, or I'm afraid I'm going to have to write to you on the detail of that. I recognise the complexity of these things and the planning implications, and I don't want to get them wrong. I don't know whether Bernadette wants to add anything on the Aylesbury Spur.
I think it is safer to write. I mean, at the moment...
Fine then, thank you very much, Greg.
Okay. Is it still the intention to launch the first part of East West Rail, which is very nearly built, on diesel-only rolling stock?
I don't know the answer to that question.
I think we are looking at the question of the diesel and electrification still in relation to East West Rail, and there are quite a number of decisions yet to be taken on how that will work.
So the question there is less about electrification or not, because I think the ship has sailed on that, because most of it's built.
By mode, I think.
It's whether it's by mode or hydrogen or whatever it might be, because as it stands, with big net zero commitments and the length of life of rolling stock at the moment, the plan is, as I understand it, to launch with diesel. That can't be a sensible decision, can it?
So that would be the stage one from Bletchley to Milton Keynes, I guess, where obviously we're much more advanced and the construction is already underway. Let me check with you exactly what the rolling stock expectation is for that section. Clearly, for the later stages through to Cambridge, there are many more. These are at a much earlier stage of development, and the questions I think about the rolling stock will be also at a much earlier stage of development.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps more broadly, East West Rail from Oxford to Bletchley has brought an old railway back to life. Beyond Bletchley is a new cutting. Before any work is done on starting beyond Bletchley towards Cambridge, will you do a full review of the lessons, particularly the impacts on communities along the line of route, especially businesses, to understand what has gone wrong in the construction of the first part?
Well, we will always listen very carefully to lessons. I mean, it's a constant part of our project delivery to reevaluate and learn lessons as we go. I'd be very interested in following up with Mr. Smith exactly the problems that you and local businesses have experienced and talking to East West Rail about those, and absolutely all of the lessons from this stage one we will want to fully process and ensure we're taking into account in later stages.
Thank you. That's all I have on rail. I want to turn to road, particularly passenger vehicles at the moment. Again, in the autumn statement, we saw fairness come back in the way all vehicle types are taxed, with electric vehicles no longer getting a freebie. Did the Department of Transport feed into that? Was that wholly a Treasury decision?
Well, I think, first of all, the tax measures, as you know, are matters for the Chancellor, and I'm not going to trespass on those. I think the implementation of vehicle excise duty I think is very sensible. I don't think it makes a significant difference to purchasing decisions, but it clearly answers one question about vehicle excise duty being available, and that's important for the revenue that we then get for investment in roads. So I think that's a welcome decision, but as you know, tax matters are matters for the Chancellor.
My question was more, did the DFT feed into that process at all? But within that, perhaps I could ask the extent to which you believe the roads budget for either building new roads, improving our existing roads, getting money to councils to manage the roads they run will go up as a result of more vehicles paying vehicle excise duty?
Well, I think, as I said in answer to the question earlier on the autumn statement, I'm very pleased that we got our spending review budgets confirmed. One of the things I'm doing at the moment, obviously, is looking at the balance of spending between capital on rail and on roads. I'm very conscious, as I said earlier, that the majority of journeys are undertaken on roads, and I want to make sure we invest in our road network, both the strategic network and what we provide for local roads, to make sure we can keep the country moving, both in terms of passenger vehicles and also freight.
That's helpful. Do you think, looking at the dynamic again between incentives that were previously offered for people to buy EVs, that we are still on track for the 2030 ban on new petrol and diesel?
I do, as you know, part of the challenge about how you deploy public money is to do it in a way that gets us to a model where the private sector can then take over. So, the initial incentives we put in place for electric vehicles actually have done their work, and we're seeing a very significant uptake in electric vehicles as far as passenger cars are confirmed. One of the things the department's also got to do is look at how we accelerate or deal with the gaps for rolling out charging. So there's a lot of private investment going into charging, and there are some areas where the department will put public money in to make sure that we can continue rolling that out. But yes, I think we are on track.
How much is the department looking at other emerging technologies, hydrogen, direct hydrogen combustion, hydrogen fuel cells, synthetic fuels on top of EVs?
So I think I'm right in saying that the department's always been technology neutral. So the objective is to get to our net zero objectives, but we're not wedded to particular technologies. And I think Gareth said in one of his earlier answers, when we were talking about the regulatory regime, actually we want to incentivise companies to look at all of those things. So exactly what the share of those will be going forward, I mean, that will depend on the development of the technology and the private investment, but it's a technology neutral approach. And clearly I've already picked up in the time I've been doing this job that for different roles, for different sorts of vehicles, there may well be different technology solutions, and we're very much encouraging all of those. I don't know whether you want to add anything, Gareth, to that.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say on cars it does feel like the momentum's with electric. I think you've sort of seen that on the back of what Tesla have done in terms of and certainly the numbers we see of new car sales. 20% now have a plug in November, so you can see the momentum going. Demand is not an issue. We've taken away some of the financial incentives. More of the constraints are on the supply side with the global disruption in supply chains, particularly around chips. Vans similarly look like more moving towards electric. There's still a big debate in trucks, particularly over 26 tonnes. Will it be hydrogen fuel cells? I was recently with Scania, and they have some very impressive electric trucks at very large scale, so you can see options there. We have got a series of trials running of both hydrogen, the overhead gantries and batteries to understand how that will fit in with the wider logistics sectors. Much more debate in maritime and aviation. Maritime at COP26, there's an interesting study published there which showed actually of countries and shipping companies around the world still a mix of ammonia, hydrogen, potentially even nuclear. On aviation, sustainable aviation fuels, and you mentioned synthetic fuels, very much seen as a core technology for the next, I was going to call it a bridging technology, but this is sort of 30 years at least, given the asset cycles. Question about the role of hydrogen and quite how long that will go. Battery planes, and I mentioned people like Vertical Aerospace before, very interesting on the more short haul for the UK domestic scene.
That's very interesting. I do want to keep these questions specifically to passenger cars, just for a couple of more quick questions. There's a lot of focus on the EV market, on the new sales from 2030. How much thought is being put into how we keep all the other cars that are on the road, potentially up to 30 million of them, running beyond 2030, potentially in a greener way, by which I really do come back to the synthetic fuel point? And how big of a priority is it to keep those cars on the road rather than to see mass scrappage schemes or things that will inevitably involve taxpayer subsidy in order to help people move on?
Clearly the legislative priority is on new vehicles, and you're right, and certainly from a carbon point of view, you have to balance those capital assets that have already been produced. You don't want them all being scrapped too soon, because actually that's not great from a carbon emissions point of view either. I've spent most of my time so far looking at the EV rollout for new vehicles. I don't know whether Gareth wants to add anything, otherwise we'll write to you.
Yeah, otherwise my main point would be the fact that we are conscious of the embedded carbon in the vehicle stock on the road. So it's not just, obviously there's a focus on emissions at the tailpipe, for particularly around air quality reasons as well, but we're also looking at how we manage the overall stock and can ensure the maintenance and improve the efficiency in the medium term.
My last area I want to talk about for roads is smart motorways. These have been a controversial subject for some years now. It was this committee's recommendations that led to one of your predecessors pausing the new rollout. But just last month, we had a 7-hour outage on stop vehicle detection. Coming up into what now appears to be strike season, there's been media reports that the human beings that monitor the technology for stop vehicle detection may well be on the strikers list. Should we just go a bit further and restore hard shoulders on all these roads until we can be confident the technology actually works? Secretary, coming into the role fresh, what is your approach to smart motorways?
So, first of all, I think it's worth saying that I think the committee did a very good job, I think, on the work that it did. It certainly was stuff that I paid attention to before I came into this role. I think the commitment that my predecessors made, I think, still stands, which is about pausing the rollout of the various types of smart motorways until we've collected a larger series of data. So that position hasn't changed. I think that's the position I'm comfortable with maintaining. On your specific point, I'll set out what I think the position is, and no doubt Bernadette will correct me. On National Highways staff, those involved in monitoring all of our road network, you're right that there have been strikes announced. I think the number of staff in National Highways who are members of the trade union who may well be striking is a relatively small number. One of the things the department's very experienced in is managing those operational issues and focusing resources on the most important areas. So I don't think we're anticipating any significant issues from a road safety perspective as a result of any of the strike days that have been announced. And I think if I got that.
That is exactly right. I mean, it's about 11% of National Highway staff are PCS members, which is the striking union. About half of those voted for strike action. So National Highways is not expecting a sort of mass walk out of staff on strike days, and it has robust contingency plans to deal with the strike impacts, and obviously it will be prioritising in those plans road safety activities. So I think some of the reports have been somewhat exaggerated about the impact on the road network.
Okay, thank you, Chairman.
Just on that, Secretary of State, I'm just going to ask you very bluntly, do you believe smart motorways are smart?
Smart or safe? Well, in terms of are they smart, I've looked at the evidence on them that has been collected so far. I think it's very sensible of my predecessors to say we're going to collect more evidence. I think we're going to be publishing some statistics on safety going forward. I think one of the things we have made a commitment about, which I'm very clear about, we have got to take the public with us on this. So whatever the data says, people have to be comfortable with them.
I don't think the public are with you.
One of the things we've set out is about investing in more emergency areas on those smart motorways that don't have hard shoulders to reassure people. But I'm very clear there's a point about data and about facts, but there's also a point about making sure that people feel safe and comfortable using the various types of smart motorways.
Would you feel safe or comfortable on a motorway that you broke down on, that the artificial intelligence doesn't see your breakdown and notify the human operators? It waits for congestion to mount up, which can take 15-20 minutes before any human person realises there's a problem on a so-called smart motorway. Would you feel safe with you and your family in a car?
Well, there are, of course, different sorts of smart motorways. On the specific ones you refer to, the all-lane running ones, yes, you're right, the technology clearly needs to be working properly, and Mr. Smith highlighted one example where there was a technology outage, and those are exactly, that's why you need to collect the data over a longer period. So I'm very clear that smart motorways have a lot of advantages, but the public absolutely has to be confident in using them. Even in scenarios which are relatively infrequent, we have to take people with us, and I think that's one of the incredibly valuable things the committee did in the work it did and the evidence it took, was to challenge government on that, and I think government responded, and I think my predecessors made sensible commitments on that, and those are commitments that I maintain.
Thank you. Your comments are noted. Ruth, you're next.
Thank you, Chair. Going back to electric vehicles, The government's committed to deliver at least 300,000 charge points by 2030. If there's going to be no transport legislation in this parliamentary session, is that deliverable? And if not, what can be delivered?
So, on the charge points, I don't think that's something that's going to be primarily delivered by legislation. There are two points I would say. A lot of the charge points are obviously going to be delivered by private investment, in businesses investing in those, in all sorts of things, and we're seeing a lot of that already. There are clearly areas where the taxpayer and my department's going to have to intervene. One of those is to make sure we have a proper network of charge points at motorway service areas and on the strategic road network. The other area is to work with local authorities on making sure we see charging options for people where they don't have the on-street stuff. No, I don't believe it does. It's going to be a combination of private investment and investment from the taxpayer in the areas where you need that extra support to make sure we deliver the charging network.
So that target is deliverable?
You can work that in.
I believe the targets that we've set out are deliverable, and we're working at pace to make sure we can deliver them.
Thank you.
Kevin.
Thanks so much, Chair. With regard to zero emission buses, it has been a bit of a thorny issue for the government since the previous Prime Minister made his 4,000 bus pledge. Well, I suppose I'll start with that. In your eyes, is the 4,000 bus pledge a pledge for England, as he's responsible for, or are you responsible for now, or was that for the whole of the UK?
I think that was a number for the whole of the UK, and I think, if I remember correctly, I think we're up to about 3,276, if I remember correctly. But it was a UK commitment, I think, the full 1,000.
When you say 3,000, I take it you're talking about monies that have been committed to local or regional authorities in England, because at the moment, according to the written answer received just a couple of weeks ago, of the 4,000, 87 are on the road in England. Another 425 are in order. That's less than 2.5%. Scotland has actually got 548, so more, 10% the size, but more than England have in terms of actually being ordered. What do you make of that progress? Well, in terms of actual ordering and procuring.
Well, in terms of progress, I mean, I welcome. I don't think there's particularly a competition here between the different parts of the United Kingdom. From our competition is fine, and I think in terms of delivering the United Kingdom's net zero commitments, I mean, frankly, the more zero emission buses we have delivered across the UK, the fine. And I'm very comfortable with different parts of the country delivering them. I'm just looking at the statistics. Yeah, 3,276 is the number that I've got. And we're continuing to deliver them. Whether we quite get to 4,000, we'll see. But that was a UK number.
Would you perhaps write to the committee to set out, because you've got a different figure than my written answer? Could you perhaps say what's been ordered, what's on the road, what's been ordered, and obviously what monies have been given to regional authorities, but also can you confirm if any monies? Last question before I hand back to Chair. If any money has been handed back from regional or local authorities in England who struggling to get operators to run said buses?
Yeah, I think given it's a fair bit of detail you want, I'm very happy to write to the committee to set out those particular aspects of it. Yeah, all of those things that you said.
Let's do that, Secretary of State. This is a quick question for you.
Thank you. Secretary of State, we have in this country regulated peak and off-peak walk-up fares that anyone should be able to buy to get on any train within the time frame. Avanti West Coast and its retailers do not sell those walk-up fares when it suits them. Have you or anyone in your department authorised Avanti West Coast to do this? And if you haven't, would you commit to a full investigation as to why that train company is in effect preventing off-peak train ticket sales and selling tickets, only allowing for sale tickets at a higher price than the off-peak regulated fare?
It's a very detailed question, Mr. Loder. I'm very happy to instruct my officials to investigate, and I will write to the committee to let the committee know.
Secretary of State. Ben Bradshaw has some more.
Thank you. Secretary of State, you very welcomely mentioned active travel in your introduction.
Yep.
In terms of your priorities. Can you update us on the signing off of the 4th round of active travel funding? Because there are about 1,500 schemes waiting to go ahead around the country, and local authorities are very keen to get this funding ASAP.
Yes, well, I was pleased to mention it because I was trying to give the sense that despite the fact that we spend a lot of time talking about railways, I'm very conscious that I want to try and make sure the department is the Department for Transport, not the Department for Trains, and we reflect the fact, a third of the trips that people make are walking, and the 2% are cycling. So, in answer to my question on the autumn statement, I'm looking at the spending of the department across the range of modes, which will include active travel. When we've concluded that, we'll be in a position then to deal with the 4th round of the active travel funding.
Give us some idea when that might be. It's just because the previous Secretary of State before the last one had already signed it off. And then when Anne-Marie Trevelyan came before us, she said she had to sign it off. And now we're waiting for you to sign it off. So, if you haven't had your budget cut and you say this is a priority, what is stopping you signing this off?
So we've had our budgets confirmed as we had in the spending review, but you'll know that there's a very significant level of inflation we're having to deal with and manage across the department, as other government departments are, and indeed the private sector. So we're having to look at the priorities across the department. When I've concluded that exercise, which we're doing at pace, we'll be in a position to make that announcement, but I'm not in a position to do that today.
So weeks, months?
Well, I'm conscious that we need to do it early enough that people can then get those funds and to deliver them. So I'm doing it at the earliest possible opportunity. I'm not going to pluck a date out of thin air and then disappoint the committee. What I will do is we've been asked to set out a number of specifics, and on the legislative programme, I will see what we can do in terms of whether I can give you a more specific answer, and we'll write to the committee and set that out.
So when your parliamentary colleague Kit Malthouse said on The World at One on the 16th of November, in the context of the new fiscal event, that active travel was a nice to have in good times, implying that this was going to be cut. That's not your view.
I think putting schemes in place that enable people to walk more safely and easily, and also to use to cycle safely, I think they are very important. But we're having to look at those across the whole piece. I'm very clear, and the reason why I mentioned it was I'm very conscious about how people travel. And I want to make sure that the decisions that we're taking to deal with inflation pressures don't unfairly penalise any particular mode of transport.
Is it still is Active Travel England's status as a statutory consultee for major planning applications still under threat? This was threatened by Simon Clarke, and I'm not aware that threat has been withdrawn. Can you clarify for us, because not least Chris Borden will be very interested in your answer?
I'm not aware of what Mr Clarke set out when he was a member of the government. He's obviously no longer a member of the government. On that specific question, let me find out, and I'll let the committee know when I write.
That's noted. Over to Graham.
Thanks, Chair. Just on the issue, now, I'm not sure whether it's fair to expect you to know this level of detail, but perhaps again you could give us some information, because as part of our inquiries into Maritime 2050 and the logistics supply chain, the Port of Dover told us that they didn't know when they would find out how the new EU entry-exit system checks that are due to come into effect in May of next year, they didn't know how they would work. I wonder if you could give some indication as to where we stand with that. And if I may as well ask my other question, also in relation to the maritime sector, there have been some criticisms about the Seafarers' Wages Bill. We're all very concerned about the appalling activities of P&O, followed by other unscrupulous employers. But we're concerned about how international agreements are going to be affected, and if there's a possibility of circumventing the legislation by what's being called port hopping, and how can we avoid that?
Okay, so on your last point on the Seafarers' Wages Bill, which has obviously been introduced into the House of Commons, I'm hoping for an imminent announcement about when we're going to get the second reading of that bill. On the specific issue, the bill obviously has a very specific purpose to deal with shipping in UK territorial waters. On the specific point you raise, I don't have the answer to that. I will find out and write to the committee and also make sure we have that when we debate second reading of the legislation. On your Paul de Dover question, so one of the first visit that I did actually, which was to go and visit the Kent Resilience Forum and also the Port of Dover and Eurotunnel to talk about a range of issues, but also to talk about the European system. So it's fair to say I think that the European Union hasn't published a great deal of information about how this is going to work. There were concerns about that were raised by all of the stakeholders. My department is working closely with the port, with other parts of the UK government, but also working closely with the European Commission and the French government to try and understand how this is going to be implemented and what the requirements are going to be on us, and particularly at the juxtaposed controls, and that work is underway. But obviously it's a European Union system, and they need to tell us how what the requirements are going to be, and we will obviously then work to comply with them and work with the port to make sure we can...
And if you've met with the Kent Resilience Forum and the Port of Dover, you'll understand their concerns about the logistics supply chain and so on. When did you have that meeting, just out of curiosity? Was it recently?
It was a couple of weeks ago, yeah.
All right, okay, thanks. Chair.
Thank you, Graham. Secretary of State, just before I move on to Gavin next, I'm conscious that you are going to be writing to us with answers and details on various different subjects, and I'm conscious that your two permanent secretaries are sitting right next door to you. So as a matter of process, you don't have to write to us just with one letter. Do let us have the information as it becomes available, if that's okay. Is that all right?
We always, as you know, seek to provide the swiftest possible and fullest possible responses to the committee.
Very happy to receive a number of different letters from you and your department. So, Gavin.
Thanks so much, Chair. Turning to, I suppose, decarbonisation again, and looking back to COP26 with the Clydebank declaration at COP26. So, in terms of progress, will the UK have a green shipping corridor by 2025?
So we, as you know, we made a commitment at COP working with some of our global partners about that green shipping corridor. There were 24 countries have committed to supporting the establishment of those, and we're trying to work and lead that work. I think I don't know, Gareth, do you want to add anything specific on the timing?
No, I think the timing, it will take longer than 2025, as you say, because in terms of, but you've got to work through both the actual ships, the port technologies as well, but in terms of progress we saw at COP27, it was pretty impressive the number of countries that are leaning into this now. We've got agreements with the US, Norway and the Netherlands. Similarly, the department has put in already £34 million into over 80 projects across the UK around the clean maritime demonstrations. This is about getting the port side technology right. But I think we shouldn't underestimate the scale of the challenge to get the green shipping corridors right. Yeah. But that is a big focus for the department, as the Secretary of State has said.
And obviously, it's not in your gift or your control because obviously it's international and whatnot. Right. What would be your best estimate as to when you'd hope to have the first green shipping corridor in place?
I'm balancing between being optimistic and not wanting to disappoint you on this one. I think I'll play back the answer a number of people made at COP27, so just to give you a sort of sense of where the international community is on this. They were saying sort of the back end of this decade. That was where they thought they would be fully operational. Before that, I would expect to see pilots running, and particularly around, I'm interested in what's going on back to Dover on the short straits and some of the routes. And I think actually, again, outside of this country, the US, Singapore links are actually very interesting. But it's going to be second half of this decade will be my expectation where you see real progress. One of the important things we are working on is to build the international coalition on the back of COP, both 26 and 27 at the IMO, to have the focus there on zero emissions and building that coalition, just as we have done with international aviation emissions.
Yeah, just before I move on to aviation, Secretary of State, the EU's just voted to bring shipping emissions into its carbon market, including international voyages. Does the UK plan to do something similar?
I come in. Carbon budget 6 for the UK, which is around 2035, will include, and I think we've announced this previously, international aviation and shipping emissions. And even to date, what we do is when we have the carbon budgets, we make an allowance for international emissions, so they are in effect accounted for in the system. This is not sort of an off-book set of numbers.
Okay, moving on to aviation, and I'll come back and touch on emissions, but in terms of aviation in general, Secretary of State, are you confident now, given everything that we've gone through, that airlines and airports have the staffing capacity to avoid a repeat of the disruption we've seen this summer, and to some degree obviously still continue to see, but not to the same degree?
Yeah, I think following what happened this summer, I think we've done a lot of work with both airports and airlines about testing and challenging them on their resilience. And I think the work that we've done, particularly talking to them about the Christmas and winter period, I think we're confident. We've tested their plans, and I think they've dealt with some of the issues that they had during the summer. The big challenge, of course, coming back to some of my previous answers, is of course we are expecting, because the unions have suggested that there may well be some industrial action in the aviation sector, both for public employees and those working for airports and airlines, and that will clearly have an impact, and airports and airlines will have to respond accordingly. But in terms of their base processes, I think there's been a lot of work done since the summer to try and avoid that disruption that we saw.
Yeah, and a lot of disruption was caused in or by the ground handling sector, which of course is one of the lowest paid parts of the aviation sector, and there's supposed to be a review of the ground handling market. I know Heathrow themselves were reviewing ground handling at the airport, but the government were looking at ground handling. So where are you with reviewing it? I know there's been different teams at the DFT, but we're told they were reviewing it. So are you aware of any progress?
That commitment was given before I came into post, so I'll ask Gareth.
The review's ongoing at the moment, and we're looking to have the report ready for the Secretary of State in the early new year.
Early new year?
Yeah, early new year.
Okay, thanks. In terms of the recovery itself in the sector, as many of us warned, and obviously as we've seen with other downturns in aviation, the recovery is always unequal. So you'll see Heathrow come back a lot quicker than regional airports, and we've seen the same with Glasgow. Glasgow, for instance, still 70% of 2019 levels. What do you plan to do as a department to try and assist? We've seen that with issues of Doncaster, obviously. What are you going to do to assist airports like Glasgow, like Newcastle, etc., to recover? Because jobs are an issue at these airports.
Well, they are. I mean, look, to some extent, we've seen significant changes in travel patterns post-COVID, and I think actually, my experience looking at the travel sector, we shouldn't just assume that things are going to go back how they were before. I mean, people have now made, certainly as far as businesses are concerned, people are now able to do things that they weren't previously able to do. They're prepared to do things before. We've seen changes in business travel and international travel. So I think the government will do what we can. If there are barriers that are in place that we need to look at, we'll look at those. But to some extent, some of this work's going to be done by airlines and airports, looking at passenger experience, looking at different travel patterns, looking at responding to their services to meet the changing needs of both business and leisure travellers. I don't think just assuming things are going to flip back to what they were before, I don't think is necessarily the right assumption.
And that's an entirely fair point. A large part of this piece will be to regional connectivity, which is another issue we've been trying to push the government to respond on. But previously we've spoken about our previous reports from this committee spoke about PSOs, and perhaps that more PSOs might be required to generate that revival as well as providing more connectivity. All the PSOs currently the UK government support are to and from London, and that was a change we were advising should make. Is that something you'd be looking to look at in the coming months?
On the public service obligations, I've certainly got an open mind about those. I think you have to look at those on a case-by-case basis. It's about the need, balancing the need against the cost to the taxpayer. So I don't have a closed mind about those where we judge that they're necessary, and the need and the cost. There's a sensible balance, and I think we're perfectly happy to take those on a case-by-case basis. So I wouldn't want to give you a general answer. We'll look at the specific circumstances, but we're certainly open to looking at them.
Okay, we've seen reports in the press recently. There may well be changes coming, or changes afoot with regard to liquids and hand luggage, perhaps from 2024. Is this correct?
Well, obviously we continue to keep these things under review. There are a number of pilots going on about looking at new technology and how you deal with that. If there are any changes that are going to take place more widely, then obviously we'll make announcements in due course. There will have to be clear communications around those, obviously, to make sure passengers know what's going on. So if we announce any of those, we will do those in a proper way, announce them properly with clear communications for people, as I said, when we've learned the lessons of the pilots that are being undertaken.
And if this is to be a mandated change, and given what I said in the previous question, might there be support available for some airports to make this change if it's a government mandate?
Well, if there are any changes in requirements that we make, we will do those in the usual way. But I think we're leaping ahead of ourselves here. When we make announcements, we will do those in the usual way, and we'll set out what our expectations are and what the responsibilities are of the government, but also of the private sector partners.
Okay, and lastly from me, the issue of decarbonisation, which obviously is tougher for aviation than any other sector, but the easiest thing we can do and the quickest thing we can do is airspace modernisation. So where are we with it? Are you pleased with current progress?
Bernadette?
I think this is
Gareth.
So, I mean, I think one of the issues we've had with airspace modernisation over the last 2 years, obviously, has been the impact on the finances of the industry. This has been primarily funded by the airports, and obviously we've had to go slower than we might want it to, due to their impact, due to their ability to fund it. We have put in, as a government, best part of £10 million to fund some airspace modernisation, and we see this as, this can seem like quite a technical issue, but obviously, as you reflect on, it's about, you might save up to 10 to 15% of aircraft carbon emissions by modernising airspace. I think the free route airspace in Scotland has been an incredible success. We want to sort of build on that lesson. We've asked the CAA to come forward with an updated airspace modernisation plan, and they're due to do that in the early new year.
Yeah, from what I understand, it would perhaps only take a government investment of around £20 million to get this, to perhaps get this done. Is that not something you'd consider?
Well, certainly once we get the report from the CAA, we'll absolutely look at what, if there are any financial consequences, we'll absolutely look at them, and we'll look at what and have to balance those off against the other priorities. But I'm certainly very keen to look at what the CAA bring forward.
Okay, and this is the last question. The other achievable method or route to decarbonisation that's within reach is sustainable aviation fuels. So the government are obviously fully aware of that. There's a commitment for 5 plants, I think, are to be under construction by 2025, and a SAF mandate by, I think, 2030 of 10% is the from memory. But the current plans would only have the current plans for sites would only produce 5% instead of 10%. So there's obviously a lot more work to do. Would you consider, as this committee has suggested previously, looking at a pricing support mechanism such as a CFD type model for sustainable aviation fuels?
So what you've said, Mr. Newns, in terms of the commitments are correct, and I'll ask Gareth just to set out on the CFD.
Yeah, I'm very conscious the industry is very interested in the idea of having some sort of contract for difference mechanism to support the growth of a sustainable aviation fuel. So as you say, we've got the demand side incentive through the mandate, which is really important. I think the big question now is, can you also get the industrial benefits? The mandate will ensure we reduce carbon emissions, but can you actually get the industrial benefits? And I think, for me, the strength of the UK chemical industry suggests there's a real potential comparative advantage here. We've put in, as a government, £165 million of start-up funding for some of the plants. Contract for differences, obviously there's an attraction around that, and I think that's been used on solar and offshore from memory. The risk is if you get this wrong, it's incredibly expensive for the taxpayers, and you've got to get the calibration of that entirely right. And given the wider pressures on public finances, it's important that, yes, we look at it, and we are looking at it within the department, but also just recognise actually the value for money questions for the taxpayer on this.
And I accept that the danger is we might fall behind the rest of the world if we don't progress with CFD. But anyway, Chair.
Well, thank you very much, Gareth and Secretary of State. And before I come to Ruth, I'd just like to congratulate my colleague on getting 3 final questions in. Ruth, I'm conscious we hopefully Secretary of State will maybe overrun until about 10 minutes, so maybe 20 to 12 will finish. Ruth.
Thank you. Secretary of State, given the differing travel patterns that you've just mentioned and also constrained carbon budgets that are coming in, do you still support the expansion of Heathrow Airport and Bristol Airport?
So I'm just conscious on Heathrow, the complexity of the legal position there, and I don't want to jump into that. But look, I'm very conscious that we, on the issue about Bristol Airport and Heathrow. Bristol, I know there's a planning issue going on at the moment. I'm just very conscious I don't want to dive into those and cause any legal difficulties. So I've asked the Permanent Secretary to...
Shall I say something on Heathrow? I mean, look, Heathrow, the legal situation is as it was. There was a series of court cases, I'm sorry, I'll forget the year now because of COVID, but it's probably 2019, 2020, that we worked through various challenges. The national airspace planning system is now in place. It's up for Heathrow. This has always been, I think it was said in the manifesto, a private sector promoted scheme. It's up for Heathrow then to come forward with plans for how they want to do that. Obviously, given the impact on their finances of COVID, that's been on hold, and we've yet to have conversations with Heathrow where their position is on this one. More generally, I think we're looking at what the forecast for aviation numbers will be, which is absolutely the heart of the planning statement. And the assessment to date has been continued uncertainty in the aviation market means it's hard to make future forecasts, and we're waiting for the market to settle down before we then come forward with the future forecast.
Didn't answer about the carbon budgets.
So that's the heart of the carbon budget question, is basically because previously the assessment for the planning statement was made when we the net zero commitment from the government. So once we understand the nature of future demand, or at least the uncertainty as comes in, will then be the opportunity for the Secretary of State then to review the planning guidance.
Thousands of people in this country were deprived of their legal right to compensation when their flights were disrupted or cancelled over the last year. When are you going to give the CAA the powers that it needs to ensure that airlines obey the law, and the powers that this committee has called for it to be given repeatedly for many years?
So this is one of the questions. I've had my introductory meetings with the CAA chairman and chief executive, and their ability to intervene in the consumer space is one of the things I'm looking at very closely. So it's one of the things I've discussed with them. I'm not able to give you a specific timetable. It's maybe one of the things I can set out in writing for the committee.
Lovely. And in principle, do you think it would be wrong to water down the British public's current right to compensation when their domestic or inter-European flights are disrupted?
So I'm very keen that I want to make sure that we continue to protect consumers, and I want to make sure that the regime for consumer protection, continues to deliver, what we think is right. And I want to look at that. I mean, see whether we can improve it, maintain it, or alter it in any way. But I'm very clear that we want to protect consumers and give them confidence.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Secretary of State. Jack Brereton has some questions for you on buses.
Thank you, Chair. And obviously the pandemic's had a massive impact on local bus services and public transport more generally. So what is your vision for the future of bus?
So I'm glad you've asked that question. I touched on it in my earlier remarks, and I wanted to mention it to make sure that you knew it was a priority. So one of the things that came up at my first set of oral questions, lots of questions about buses, particularly the investment that the government's made in bus service improvement plans, a lot of the money that we've done in the city region deals have had a bus component to them as well. And I'm also very conscious that the challenges that bus services have had with COVID and the post-COVID period, and I know in my own constituency there are some real challenges in delivering sustainable bus services, particularly in rural areas. One of the things I'm very pleased that the department's doing, as well as the funding that we're delivering, is some of the pilots that we're doing about how you can deliver bus services in a way that's more sustainable. So, for example, in my own constituency, delivered before I was Secretary of State, there are some pilots on demand responsive transport in two parts of Gloucestershire, and I'm looking forward to seeing the evidence from those. So I'm very supportive of buses. I'm very supportive of us looking at how we can grow bus ridership. It's still a significant lower level than it was pre-COVID, and I want to work with local authorities having those ambitious plans to grow bus ridership in the future, and the government will look at what we can do to support them.
As you say, there's been a massive struggle to try and get bus ridership back to pre-pandemic levels. So is it still your and the department's view that we want to get bus ridership up above pre-pandemic levels? I mean,
where it exactly comes to is obviously going to be a decision for individuals, but I do think we want to grow bus ridership higher than it is at the moment, and clearly get it back to the sort of levels we were looking at. So that's why I think the bus service improvement plans that we've been doing we've tried to encourage local authorities to have ambitious plans to grow bus ridership. One of the things I briefly talked about when I talked to Northern mayors on my visit, we will come back to, we spent a lot of time talking about trains. I had some very good conversations with Andy Street about his plans for buses in the West Midlands. So I'm very keen that we work with local authorities who have ambitious plans on growing bus ridership, and also look at different models. One of the advantages of devolution is we can look at different ways of managing bus services in different areas to try and grow the ridership, have a more modern bus fleet, and make them easier for people to use, and also join up transport opportunities across different modes and having better ticketing opportunities for people, so they'll give people more choices.
Jack, Chris.
Thank you, Chairman. Finally, Secretary of State, from me, what measures will you bring in to support the local authorities that missed out on the funding through the bus service improvement plan options? Places such as Dorset, Buckinghamshire and others that have very few bus services now as.
So I was very clear, and it again came through very clearly from colleagues that raised these questions at our oral question session, that there's a lot of unfulfilled demand. People that had quite ambitious plans for bus service improvement plans that we couldn't fund. So I'm very conscious as we work through our autumn statement work that I want to make sure we've got an appropriate level of funding for bus services in the future, so that we can continue to have those opportunities to come forward.
Are there any specific measures that you're looking to implement, or any exciting initiatives to bring buses
Well,
back?
we've obviously got, in the first part of the year, you'll be aware of between January and March, we've got the £2 bus fare to try and deliver, again, an improvement in ridership in the first 3 months of next year. And I'm looking at what opportunities we can have to continue to have opportunities for local authorities to bring forward ambitious plans. And we'll be able to set more out when we've finalised our work on our autumn statement.
So as it stands today, a number of rural counties from March look to lose quite a lot of their bus services that we have. As it stands today, there are no measures in place from the 1st of March to basically bring bus services back, or to do some exciting things to bring bus services to those who need them.
So I'm clearly very well aware of some of the money that we've put into supporting bus services post-COVID, specifically focused on that. Those run out at the end of March. I'm very clear that I want to make sure we continue supporting bus services. So one of the things I've tasked my team to do as we work through the financial settlement from the autumn statement is what's the right level of support that the department needs to continue doing for buses, and what sorts of things do we need to continue doing. So the absence of having said something today I don't think should be read either way. I'm very conscious we'll need to say more about buses in the near future.
Previously, we've had a number of quite difficult sessions with Baroness Fear when she was Minister for Buses. And I think it's fair to say that we took evidence from a number of rural county councils that did show that there was not a very satisfactory relationship between county councils and the department. Would you today commit to hold a summit with leaders of rural county councils, certainly across England and maybe further afield, in order to get their feedback firsthand, so you can actually maybe take some of their ideas and suggestions to drive forward?
Well, look, I think two things. First of all, I'm very well aware, because of the part of the country I represent, I'm a Member of Parliament in Forest of Dean, which is a rural part of Gloucestershire, which is a broadly rural county. I think my constituency has some of the challenges which I suspect I share with yours about how do you deliver a good bus service in a rural area where you obviously don't have the level of ridership that you'll have in a more urban area, and there are some challenges about doing that in a sustainable way. That's exactly why the department's looking at some of these innovative ways of delivering bus services. So in terms of your of interacting with local authorities, I don't want to immediately leap to a summit as a solution, but I'm very open to that. So let me go away and look at what work we were already doing with local authorities. I'm very committed to improving the engagement we have with local authorities, particularly those in rural areas. But let me just not leap to a particular solution, but I will look at what things we can do going forward. Certainly not closing my mind to that solution.
Thank you, Chris. Secretary of State, just a few closing questions. On buses, what is the department doing? I know this is before your time, so you might want to write to us, but what is the department doing with the bus service network reviews that local transport authorities were required to submit by July? If you're not aware, then one of your two...
I'm not aware.
I will write, just so I give you a precise
Thank you
answer.
very much indeed. One of the things we haven't touched on today is road haulage, driver facilities, and the planning regime that's in place currently that negates improving the lot for road haulage drivers. Would you like to give us an update on that rather than answer something now, as well as on your thoughts on the supply chain and any issues that have been apparent over the past 2-3 years and moving forward over the next two?
We'll write to you with a fuller answer, but you may be aware of what Richard Holden, the Roads Minister, set out last week, and set out some support that we've made available to improve the facilities for HGV drivers, which I think is really important. And we've obviously done a lot of work with the industry on making sure we can make more tests available, so that actually we can increase the number of HGV drivers to deal with the shortage we saw. We've made good progress on that. It's not done yet, but we've made good progress, and maybe we'll give some more information about that when we write to the committee. I don't know whether Bernadette wants to add anything now.
Just to say that I think actually we've made good progress. As you'll recall, last year we had a sort of 33-point action plan, I think, to deal with a then quite pressing issue of HGV driver shortages, of which the testing was a key part. I think we have made good progress. I think the industry is now reporting a much improved situation in terms of availability of HGV drivers. So I think we're feeling more confident about that. I think your questions may also refer to our future plans for freight beyond
specifically
HGV
driver
drivers.
facilities. I know the government has made some monies available, which has been welcomed.
Indeed.
But actually, the planning regime is the real roadblock.
Okay, so it's a planning issue. We will write to you on that.
Is that okay? And Bernadette, DVLA.
Yes.
Are there any things you'd like, any salient points you'd like to make the committee aware of? Have there been any further improvements?
I think, as you now, as I hope you know, DVLA have now addressed all of the backlogs. The one remaining area of difficulty is drivers' medicals, which is an important area. I and the CEO and my Director General responsible for this area gave evidence to the Public Accounts Committee a couple of weeks ago on this, and I refer you to that. I think it was an exhaustive session with many questions, and I think a lot of progress has been made as I hope our testimony demonstrated. I do think what we also acknowledged is that there are still significant challenges around drivers' medical. Partly that's dealing with the backlog, but I think there is a prospect. We do expect that to have been addressed by the beginning of the new year. But I think what the committee identified correctly was as a sort of wider systemic issue. This is a really challenging area of the DVLA's work, partly because of the nature of an ageing population with multiple medical conditions who naturally want to continue to drive, but we need to find a system capable of dealing with those cases, I think, in a more effective way, and that is certainly something that I and my colleagues in DVLA are looking very hard at. But I think on the whole, I believe that the DVLA, notwithstanding the challenging hearings it has faced here in the past, has done really a good job of addressing the backlogs that were created during the pandemic.
Specifically for you, Secretary of State, MOTs and the regime in this country, if it's not broke, does it need fixing?
Well, you know, my predecessor made some commitments there. I'm very focused on, I think, for me, it's about outcomes. It's about making sure we have safe vehicles on the road. So I will continue to keep that under review and looking at what the evidence tells us. But I'm a great fan of it, as you said, if it's not broke, don't fix it. But if there are genuine things that we do need to change and there's good evidence supporting them, then I'm very open to doing that as well.
Okay. Jack, you might have had another question. No, you haven't? Ben?
Just to clarify the confusion over the legislation earlier, the last Transport Secretary did tell this committee in October that she was continuing to pitch for a narrow bill that would address some of those issues, just to clear that up. But Dame Bernadette seemed to have forgotten that, although she was here. So what changed? Did you decide to stop pitching, or...?
So on that specific thing, so I don't think we were necessarily at cross purposes there. I thought when you asked me the question, you said that she'd confirmed that she was going to bring forward a bill. What you're now saying is she was pitching for it. My understanding is the position when I took over this role was that there isn't a legislative slot for a transport bill in the third session, and that's not going to take place. I think that's right.
I think that is correct.
We look forward to the very full written
But we'll set that
clarification.
out. We'll set that out comprehensively when we write.
Secretary of State, your colleagues as well, thank you very much indeed for what has been a lengthy session. At times, shall we say, feisty? But I think we all got our points across, and really for us, it's to get information from you, and I think you've imparted quite a lot. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman.
Order.
Thank you.
The proceeding has ended.